This is Continuum Drag, a podcast where we watch sci-fi, fantasy, and everything in between. This week, Frank Herbert's Children of Dune, Part 2.
Oh, but you need help, granddaughter. The others in here, they want your entire consciousness. They want to drive you out, but I only want a tiny little corner for myself. An occasional moment with your senses. Yeah? An occasional taste. An occasional touch. Oh, no one need ever know.
Welcome to Continuum Drag, the podcast that will permit boredom to pass through it because boredom is the mind killer. I'm Luke, here with my co-host Jordan. What's real, Jordan?
I'll say this about this second episode. There's a lot of stuff coming at the viewer.
Yeah, did you feel like you were inundated with entertainment?
I don't know if it was entertainment. I also don't think it was necessarily bad. It's just like, it's a lot. You know what it felt a little bit like? You're at a party and you meet someone and they're a nice, engaging person, and they're really into something, and they tell you all about it in intricate detail, and you're like, God bless you and your hobby. Like, I wish you nothing but the best. But man, are you giving me a lot of detail, you know?
Well, before we get into it, Jordan, I thought we'd play a little game just to ease us into Dune, Children of Dune, Part 2.
Sure, let's do it.
I cannot remember the last time we did this game, but it's the one where you get three options, Jordan. You get a marriage of political convenience.
Yeah.
Or you can possess and become an abomination with someone.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can feed someone to a sandworm.
Those are good. I have to say, the possession thing in this might be my favorite thing in this episode.
It is pretty good.
Yeah.
And I broke it down. I've got four possible groups of people here, which you have to choose whether you want to marry, possess, or feed to a sandworm.
Okay.
Your first one is Paul Atreides.
Mm-hmm.
Leto 2, the sequel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or Duncan, Idaho.
Oh. Well, I don't know if I was on Team Duncan before, but something about this episode, and I felt a little bad for him when, a spoiler, he watches like his I'm assuming now wife or his partner sleep with someone else, and he just like watches them in the shadows being like, why yada yada. I felt real bad for him. So I'm gonna choose him. I'll be a nicer person to him, so we'll have a marriage of convenience or whatever it's called. I'm gonna possess old Leto 2. He seems like he'd be fine with it. He's got lots of visions and stuff. He'd just be like par for the course, you know. And then I unfortunately, Paul, who in this we'll talk about, he's become a real vagabond. I'm tossing him to the sandworms.
All right, good choices. I think good choices. Here's your next category.
He won't see it coming anyways. Am I right?
Because he has no eyes.
Yeah.
So mirroring the first category, we have kind of I would put them as the sort of lead female characters. You've got Chani,
Mm-hmm.
You've got Irulan, and you've got a character who I never heard anyone say it out loud, but that might be me getting bored. I think it's pronounced Ganima.
Yeah,
Ganima.
Ganima, yeah. It's Ghanima.
That's correct.
I think I'm gonna. She seemed all right. I mean, she's got maybe undertones of some sort of incest thing going with her brother. I don't know if I was just reading into that, but sometimes it got a little weird. But she seemed all right. I'll have a marriage of convenience with her. She's gonna, she's royalty. That's a pretty
it's a good political marriage.
Yeah.
You're gonna unite your houses. It's great.
Yeah. Everyone's complaining about stuff. I'll be like, oh, what fancy breakfast am I having today on Arrakis? So I'll do that, and then who are my two other options?
Chani and Irulan.
Well,
Paul's two wives.
Yeah. Oh, poor Irulan. Maybe I should have picked her. I feel bad for her. I think Irulan, she needs something to do. She's kind of like bored up in the castle. I'm going to get her. She's going to be possessed, I think.
Okay.
And then here's the deal. Nothing against Chani, but she's already dead. So let's just toss her to the sandworms.
It's already happened.
It's already established.
All right, Jordan. Here's your next category. Your powerful power brokers in the background. You've got Lady Jessica.
Yeah.
You've got Aaliyah.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got a person who I will mispronounce as well, Princess Whimsicott.
That's the Susan Sarandon character?
Yeah, Susan Sarandon.
Yeah, I think Oh, by the way, in the last podcast, I kept calling her Alice Cringe, and you corrected me, and you're absolutely right. It's not even spelled cringe; it's Krieg, and I don't know why. For my whole life, I thought it was Kringe. So sorry to her and anyone who had to listen to that. So I'm clearly wrong because I looked it up after, and I was like, "What's wrong with me?" Anyways, I have to say, I don't remember if she played her in the first series. I don't think she didn't. I liked her in this episode. I think she had a little meat to her scenes. So I'm gonna marry.
Yeah, she's bringing that Susan Sarandon heat here.
Yeah. So I'm gonna marry her. I think I'm gonna possess old Susan Sarandon because she's conniving and she needs a little lesson taught to her. But here's the deal: I really liked. Well, I didn't really like her, but she was all right. Alia in the first episode. But man, has she turned into something else. She's a piece of work. So I'm tossing her to the sandworm.
All right. And your final category, Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
The grab bag category.
I already like it.
Baron Harkonnen.
Yeah.
A fish guy from the Spice Guild or Spacing Guild or whatever.
Which one was he?
Just the fish guy. One of the fish guys.
Oh, one of the fish guys. Oh, okay.
And Bejazz.
Here's one rule we have to have for the podcast. You can't say bejazz when I'm taking a sip of my tea. Because that's a...
I saw you go for it. I knew you were making a mistake.
Well, I mean, obviously, you're marrying bejazz. Because you want to hear him say, top of the morning, it's time for some morning or something. You're like, all right, Jazz, it's a little early, my friend.
All right, Bejazz, you rhymed morning with morning that time. Get it together.
So I'm gonna marry him just for the lols, as the kids say, or they did 20 years ago. You have to go Harkonnen. You got to possess him. He seems like he's good at it. And
he's ready to go.
Yeah, and then fish guy, whatever. Let's give a little treat to the sandworms.
Oh, that is a treat. They don't get many fish guys.
Exactly. They're like, salty.
All right, Jordan. That's enough prelude. Shall we get into the episode?
That was great. Let's do it.
Here's the IMDb summary for Part 2. As conspiracies to gain political power abound, Paul's power base is eroded from within, and his highly ambitious sister, Alia, is gaining a political foothold. The Lady Jessica, her mother, returns to Dune, bracket Arrakis, end bracket, to visit her grandchildren, Leto II and Ghanima. And that is a slightly edited down summary courtesy of Masta Rida.
Oh, well, I think Masta there pretty much got it. I think, as we sort of alluded to at the very beginning of this, there's a lot of information, and I think they're taking some really dense material, and it's 2 books, right, that they're like sort of like slowly swishing down here.
Well, this is the beginning of the second book, so
right.
These next 2 are just the second book.
So I think if there's an issue or challenge they're finding is the sort of info dump, and it's not even so much an info dump as much as like every scene you're like, sorry, what is happening? Like, you can't not pay attention because it's like an encyclopedia coming at you. I do feel like probably this is at its best is that sort of and maybe this is not a fair comparison. I think what people liked about a Game of Thrones sort of show was these sort of political intrigue of people saying things but meaning other things, and alliances being formed, and shifting, and who's loyal to who, all that sort of like that sort of, again, like political intrigue, with fantasy and stuff. I think people like that, and I think this is probably one of the precursors to that, and it probably, at its best, when done well, is very interesting and, would be something a little bit more watchable. I think its biggest issue is maybe just the time it came out, where like this feels like a season of a TV. Even an hour and a half doesn't feel long enough, and so what you get is at all times you're a little bit bewildered as an audience member, and it's like, it's not that it's not interesting, you're just like, I think it's too hard to grab onto all of these concepts and all these characters and what everyone's doing, and it's not that they're not doing a pretty admirable job. I just think like time is against them. Would you agree with me?
That's a good read of it, I'd say. Yeah, you're kind of getting the Coles notes of something. And you're like, oh, I bet in the longer version that was a really cool intrigue how they betrayed them that way, instead of like they did it in 5 minutes and it's like, gotta betray him, let's go.
Yeah, and
betrayed.
That's right. Like, and when we've said this about a lot of times about some things we watched, sometimes you're like, it's rushing too fast, and then other times it seems achingly slow because they have to set something up. But it's like set up. Everything happens now, and you're like, oh, okay, couldn't we have like paced this a little bit better? But again, it's just I think a problem of trying to jam it in an hour and a half, which seems a weird thing to say, but like there's so much stuff happening.
Yeah, I think it is the formats to blame. It's funny. I felt like nothing was happening. But I also maybe was just like, let's get on with it. I just want to see something happen.
But it's both. It's a lot of like a bunch of little subtle things that they sort of don't culminate into much because it's like, oh, don't worry, it's percolating. It's like, but I'm just watching things percolate.
Well, part 2 jumps, I would say, somewhere between 15 to 20 years into the future.
Yeah.
The most disturbing reveal, of course, being that in part 1, Alia was 15 years old, and I was like, oh no.
Was that how old she was? 15?
Yeah, they're like, you were 15 last time. Like, shouldn't have done that nude scene.
Well, I mean, to be fair, she looks exactly the same. So, like, the actress is still 32. Yeah.
Yeah. Paul's kids are all growing. Arrakis is being terraformed. The worms are starting to disappear as a result. And Lady Jessica, old granny's coming to visit her grandkids for the first time.
Mm-hmm. And they really hint at, or a hint, they mention it several times that it's weird she's been gone so long. The grandkids kind of feel odd about it because, again, they've now, you're right, like nearly 20 years old. They haven't met her. Her daughter feels kind of abandoned and has a lot of like residual issues from her childhood that kind of come to the front. But like for the most of the show, it's just like, ooh, she's here. That's interesting. That's different that she's decided to come here, and they'll have scenes where they try to get to know each other. There's a lot of that, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's it. Alia, for her part, she's obviously nervous about her mother coming. She's worried her mother might have gone back to the Bene Gesserit. And also that is stemming from the fact that, as we know, she's pre-born. Like Paul, she could see the future, but recently those visions have stopped happening. She can no longer see the future, so she's quite out on a limb now and feels quite I guess disadvantaged.
Yeah, and I think maybe they could have leaned into this a little bit because there's not a lot of time for it. But if you have to think about it, if you have, for all intents and purposes, this almost superpower or this ability, and it's suddenly taken away, it must feel like someone who's lost a limb or has lost some sort of ability.
Your eyes, maybe?
Yeah, your eye. Yeah. I'm sure there's a real feeling of paralysis of choice because you suddenly don't have the context you're used to.
I will say this, because we're seeing that from Alia, and then we're seeing the Atreides twins, Leto 2 and Gaminia.
Yeah.
Ganima.
People are going to be so angry, yeah?
They're going to be so angry. And they're also pre-born, also have the same visions, but man, they are chill and cool, and they seem fun to hang out with, and they just don't let anything bother them. They're like, yeah, sure, it's all up there. Who knows what's going to happen? Golden Path. But like, let's go hang out. Let's go drive one of those spaceships around.
That was a funny kind of opening of like, I think they were trying to show like Leto. How do you pronounce it? Leto? Sort of that he's like
Leto,
whatever he is. He's a bit of not a loose cannon, but he's a bit of an adventurer. He has that sort of streak in him that he's a little bit swashbuckling. Because this scene, it's like he's just supposed to fly the little spacecraft, but he like takes it real close to the sandworms just to get that thrill.
Yeah. 3 sandworms come up. One tries to eat him, but he gets out of there. All well. Their nanny/stepmother is apparently been looking after them all this time.
Yeah.
And she's in the back being like, ooh.
I think there's probably is really interesting in the books. Sorry that I haven't read them. What a weird relationship to have had, that your father has this not only other marriage, but a marriage of convenience. And then your real mother dies and she raises you because your dad's off with no eyeballs, being like a monk. Like, that's something.
Yeah. So that kind of sets up our characters. And of course, Lady Jessica's arriving. They have a big welcome ceremony. Everyone in the city gathers around to see her. And included in that everyone is a strange, no-eyed preacher who comes out, who we, the audience, is like, well, that looks exactly like Paul. And you can all see him perfectly. Why did none of you realize?
He just looks a little bit like I do right now while we're recording, having not slept. He just looks a little bit rough. He looks a little bit worse for wear. And am I wrong? He didn't like lose his eyes in the last one, but it looks like he's missing his actual eyeballs, right?
Yeah, he's got huge black sockets in his eyes now.
Yeah, like, did he pull his useless eyes out? Is that what he did?
I couldn't tell you. He seems to have added some makeup to maybe accentuate.
Yeah. He's in a real period right now. He's like, look, if I'm going to be blind, you're all going to know it.
And he interrupts this welcome ceremony basically to call out the cult of the Mohadib and basically be like, the religion's gone corrupt, it can't be trusted anymore. And this like causes a riot to break out, a suicide bomb comes off, and essentially we know pretty quickly it's like, ooh, things are still pretty tense here on Arrakis.
Yeah, but like, he's got some cheek, huh?
Oh, he's got a little cheek.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah, to be fair, Mohadib, Paul, you've kind of started this problem here. And then he's like, things are bad, am I right? that guy Paul really sucks. You're like, yeah, I agree with that guy over there. And it's like, come on, Paul, you started this problem.
Well, I guess as we discussed last episode, you can really see like why he's the villain of these pieces.
Mm-hmm. It is a very interesting take. Also really interesting to have him, for all intents and purposes, go off into the sidelines for this. Like, he has maybe 3 scenes where you see him kind of do this sort of thing a couple times, but that's the extent of it. It's really about his kids and his sister and his mom and in some or lesser extent, Susan Sarandon's character, trying to plot and who's going to rule and in what manner is this going to happen and what's the path forward. He's just sort of there to be like, everything sucks, guys. That last government was terrible, am I right?
Well, Leto too, he kind of wants to break away from the royal lineage. He's not interested in ruling so much as he kind of, as you said, wants adventure. But he also has these visions from his father, so he kind of knows he's like, what I want to do is follow my dad's kind of golden path that he's laid out for me. And it's really, that's also bothering Alia because like she needs some help running the planet, running the empire, and like both him and his sister have visions, and they could easily fill in for her lack of vision, and like neither of them are willing to like lift a finger to help.
Yeah, and it seems like the Leto more than Ganima. It seems like there's more hope or pressure put on him than her.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that comes back to the first part where Paul didn't realize somehow couldn't see he was having twins.
Right.
So I guess like she has no real like divine purpose in the plan necessarily. Like she's just kind of also there.
Right. Because that is the sense. And if that's what it is, they do a good job of just giving that feeling of like, he's sort of the dude that they really want. And like, yeah, she's there too.
Yeah, they hang out. They have a nice time. You're right. Occasionally their scenes are a little too romantic, but I just think because they cast 2 very attractive leads who are like have some charisma.
Yeah, it could be the same thing too. Because there was one scene like later in the episode where they're kind of getting changed and stuff, and I was like, here's the deal. You're both pretty attractive. I don't know how I feel about this, but I think it is just supposed to be that they have almost a symbiotic relationship, or had at one point. They were so close, whether because they're twins or because of the way they were raised, and as now they're getting older, there is the slightest schism as their personalities are developing and their goals for life might be slightly different. They're still together, but you can feel like maybe they're not as one as they once were.
Yeah. The sync is breaking. For sure. They're not as sync is breaking. They're not in sync anymore.
Right.
At any rate, Alia's also struggling with voices in her head. Having been pre-born, my understanding is she essentially carries the personalities of everyone in her lineage within her mind, essentially. And up till now, it's been something she's been able to manage, but it's starting to get worse. She's starting to hear voices. The frustrations of her life are causing them to come out more. And one of those voices includes Baron Harkonnen, who is her grandfather.
So he seems like he's actually there. Like he's like, because what they do is, and there was the first time you see it, I actually quite like the effect. She's like laying in bed, and well, to be fair, it's almost done in like an almost sexual way. Like she's sort of there, kind of like writhing, and he's on top, kind of just floating above her in this very domineering fashion. And I was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting way they shot this, and the special effects I thought looked pretty good. But like he sort of comes like almost like a genie out of like a bottle, like he's like smoke, and then he's there. And you're like, is he actually there, or is it a manifestation of him? Is it just in her mind? Is it too complicated because it what is time and what is reality is all different for her? I'm not sure exactly what it is, but like it gets increasingly real as time goes on. Like he's hugging her and they're having actual back and forth conversation. So I wasn't sure how much was in her head or how much is actually happening, or maybe it doesn't even matter because of her actions.
Yeah, I think largely speaking, my understanding is because she has all the memories and experiences of everyone before her, a version of those people continue to live on inside of her. And while she's in control, they like are mostly they're mostly memories she can dig up and stuff like that. And I think as she's kind of like having trouble, she's losing control. I guess the discipline is falling away. Like, he's not alive again. I think some when he says, he's like, I'm dead. Like, I'm dead. I'm just like I'm just like the memory of a guy, but I can help you. Like, if you utilize me as pull me out, put my personality up front. I'll keep the voices in the back. I'll help you do what you need to do, and I'll basically co-run this body with you. And all I ask in return is, I want to have sex a couple times with that priest, and give me some booze occasionally. Like, he literally says, he's like, just give me a little sensation, like, because he was a hedonist, right, in life.
Yeah.
So like, he's just like, I miss eating things, I miss like touching people, like, just give me 20 minutes a day where I fondle someone.
Yeah, and she definitely does that.
But I think that's the idea. It's like, it's not that he's alive again. It's that like the complication of being this person with all this like knowledge in your head allows for this. And they keep coming up. It's like the idea of possession. Occasionally they call her an abomination. And apparently this is when there's, I believe in the original Dune miniseries and in all the other movies, like the idea of Lady Jessica having this preborn child by accident is the Bene Gesserit don't like them. They find them to be quite a problem because like they're too powerful. They have too much information. And we're also seeing that like there's some mental illness issues to go along with it.
I think it does a pretty good job with her. It does seem like it happens pretty quick, but of her development or her sort of breakdown as a character, as she seems to get, maybe not unhinged is not the word, but she gets a little bit more, she's a little bit out of control, or she's allowing Harkonnen and other things to sort of push her in directions, so she seems a little bit less stable.
It's an interesting idea. I think you're right. Like, given a longer period of time to play with it, it would have been a much more interesting idea. Like, I think as we're talking about it, I'm realizing like, oh yeah, of course. What this is about is the kids that want to help. Her mother is not being helpful. She's kind of like out on her own, and she needs to find support somewhere. And what she finds is within herself, and it happens to be her evil grandpa who's helping her. And that is like, it's an interesting, really high-minded idea that just doesn't fully have the time to breathe. So it kind of just becomes evil and like cheats on Duncan Idaho, and just like it just kind of happens so quickly that like it doesn't. I don't think it has time to like emotionally settle with the viewer.
That's my point earlier. It's like you would think in an hour and a half they would have plenty of time, but they don't, because they have so many other little things to spend time on. And I think it's sort of put as like the D plot or E plot, and it's like when it finally comes to a head as we near the end of the episode, where there's this big scene in front of all these like courtiers or people, whatever you want to call it, this like sort of like grand ceremony thing. It's like you're like, oh, that she changed fast, but it's like, well, because we only saw it in 3 scenes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is all happening. There's an investigation to the riots and the bombing that happened at the welcome ceremony, and this leads to evidence of this old Fremen clan, the Jack'Arutu. I get it. You need to maybe add some new information, some new lore. It did feel like I'm like, oh, there's this like this Fremen thing from ancient times that the other Fremen hated because they stole the water, so they like killed them all. But maybe there's some of them are still left, and they're now called the Outcast, and like we've hidden their original homeland, and like they're the ones who are maybe causing all the problems. And we come to see that's true. Like they're basically sowing civil war because they want the Fremen to fight the Atreides because they hate them both, but they're also Fremen. And it was like a lot. I was just like, this is a lot. It just seemed.
I agreed. This was one of the few things where I think, maybe anger the people who love the books, but it felt like something that could be streamlined a little bit. Like it was just like, oh, there's also Fremen who are angry or something. I don't know if you need to have added this extra lore, because I felt the same thing. Anytime there was a scene, I'm like, okay, so who are these guys now? They look exactly the same, but they got a thing on their forehead or something.
Yeah, and it was like the whole premise of it is they're trying to get Alia to become more draconian as a leader, to like force an uprising to happen. I was just like, but I don't know if you need a separate group. Like, she's getting more draconian. You do have Princess Susan Sarandon in the background trying to also seed this rebellion. Like, it feels like she could have just found some people who are unhappy on the ground. Anyway, I get it. Like, I'm sure it's a big part of the lore, but in the course of this part 2, I was just like, this is all. I don't think this is working.
I agree. It was too much. And again, it's like you do feel at a certain point you're like, and now over to these people plotting. Now over to these people plotting. Now over to these people, they're also plotting. You're like, okay. It's a lot.
And Susan Sarandon's pretty sidelined this episode.
Yeah.
Like, she gets a couple scenes, which is fine. I'm sure she'll be back big time in this one. But one of the big pop points of this is that she sends the Atreides twins some cloaks as a gift. Also, we see her hanging out with her son, who's just like a bookworm now, and like she's just like, "Oh, my idiot son. He's never going to be a great empire. Look at him, how he feels bad for that worm I captured."
Yeah, and he's sort of like, you know, your classic. He's like, I'm the new generation. I just don't see things like my mom saw them, and I don't know what I want to do, sort of thing. And it's like kind of a continuation of what he was from the beginning. Now, let me ask you this plot point, and I know I should have caught it, so I'm sure you did. What was the whole point of the cloaks? They had tracking in them?
As I understand it, she sends cloaks to the kids because she's weaved an essence into the cloaks. And, which, okay, sure, that's one thing she's done. But their stepmom, Arulin, gets them, and she's like, well, we can't trust my sister. These are definitely like, she's done something to these cloaks. Like, she's not just going to send us cloaks out of nowhere and it not be some sort of trap. So she looks at the cloaks trying to find the problem, and she can't find it. But Alia gets mad at her for investigating the cloaks for treachery because they're a political gift and they need to treat them properly as a political gift. And so Arulin's like kicked off the council. I was just like, Alia hadn't gone that insane yet. I was like, I don't quite understand what's happening here.
Yeah, I would agree. It seemed like they'd be like, hey, look, it's a political gift. You have to say thank you. But like this whole thing of like, I'm like, well, you all know it's a trap of some sort. So why get angry at the person for doing their due diligence? Again, it was to establish that Alia's getting more suspicious, and she's getting more in her own head and questioning other people. But you're like, I don't think she did anything bad. I was like, that was actually pretty smart thing she did. But the point is that they can track these cloaks. Am I wrong?
We'll get into it a little more at the end. We see at the beginning of the episode that Susan Sarandon is training a bunch of like sci-fi lions, CGI lions to hunt people. The cloaks, I believe, have an essence in it that the lions track.
Okay.
So later,
I knew
she'll use them to kill the twins.
Yes, because we had a scene where we see them like testing stuff out. What I actually thought it was, and this is my apologies, what I thought it was they were sort of training these saber-tooth tiger type things, like how to like properly like sort of like a sheepdog, how to like properly like round up their prey.
Herd people.
That's what I kind of thought they were doing, but now it makes sense. Yes, it's because they could smell them with their cloaks on and stuff. But then I don't know why Paul was like, we should wear our cloaks. We know that they're using us to track it. We should wear them. I'm like, well, maybe just don't wear them.
Yeah, I can't explain that to you either, my friend. But Lady Jessica, the whole point of all this stuff with Alia and the fight with Arulin is that Lady Jessica's kind of onto the fact that her daughter has become possessed by someone. She's becoming an abomination. They have a scene where they're using those Bene Gesserit hand signals to talk while actually having a different conversation out loud. But she's proven right very quickly because they go to a ceremony. It's a royal hearing of appeals from commoners where people come in and like, my neighbor has 3 sheep and I only have 2. Can I have one of his sheep, kind of thing? But that's interrupted when a Fremen comes in, breaks up the decorum, and accuses Alia of knowingly destroying sandworms in the desert, and that she's like, as a leader, she's being it's malfeasance on her part, essentially.
Yeah.
And Lady Jessica, she has ties to the Fremen from her time in the original Dune, and she sides with them. And Alia freaks out. I think she like a needle shoots across the room and barely misses Lady, which I guess her daughter almost had her assassinated in those like 2 seconds.
Yeah, there was like a separate assassination attempt by Alia against her mom, because it was a scene where she was like, we have to like get rid of her, sort of thing. But then they didn't really establish what it was, and so I think you're supposed to piece together that this little arrow shot, which was very similar to what happened to Paul in the very first trilogy. The same sort of weapon type thing where it's like a little like needle of something.
In the Dune world, my understanding is they have like body like force fields. So you can't shoot someone like because the force fields will just not, because the kinetic momentum won't. But you can. That's why they have swords and knives, because you can. Something moving slower, you can stab someone.
Right.
So I think the idea these needles can like pass through those because they can move a little slower than a bullet.
And then,
don't quote me, but that's my understanding.
And Lady Jessica does a real fast little catch of it and stuff. But there was something I wanted to mention about this, because this is the big reveal that like, yes, sort of Julia's maybe not let power go to her head, but that she's now this like despot. They say at one point like the only reason she wants to like terraform the planet, which on its surface looks like a great idea. Like, it's a desert planet. There's a lot of people, and people are living in the desert under very tough conditions. And the idea being, well, if we change some of the weather and change parts of the world, you'll have more places to live. It's like, great. But it's revealed that the real reason she's doing this, and whether this was or was not Paul's intention, was that they basically want to cut the area that the deserts are in, not so much so people can live, but so that there's less area for the sandworms to produce spice, thus making the price of spice more and like enriching them. Which I was like, okay, sure, but like, you're literally the only planet in the galaxy that already has this. I think you've
Had
already
the same thought.
You've already limited it enough. Like, how much more can you limit it? Like, it just seemed like I was like, yeah, okay, but like, really, that's your plan? Like, you've already monopolized the entire industry. How much more can you? You know?
Yeah, I was just like, I this seems like a weak reasoning, and maybe it makes more sense somewhere else. I was like, all right, well, you already owned all the spice. Like, how much more? Like, now you own less of it. I think that actually hinders you more than it helps you.
Yeah, it was weird. I wasn't quite sure about that. I mean, it's an interesting idea that when something on the surface is good, and you see there's some bad motives behind it, or there's someone enriching themselves through it, as a lot of times with housing and private development is. It made me think of what's happening, you know, not just in where I am in Canada, but in a lot of places where they're building a lot of places and it looks great, but it's not places people actually want to live, and it's, you know, bought up by investors or blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, it's a bunch of people are getting rich, you know?
Yeah. Exactly. Classic villain stuff.
Yeah. Classic. It's, you know, it's funny. I had a thought, and I don't know if you remember this, and it reminded me a little bit of when I was, you know, remember Superman, the original movie, Christopher Reeve, Gene Hackman?
Yeah.
And Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor, his plan is he's buying a bunch of properties that aren't like coastal properties. They're just like seemingly not very good properties, but in California. And his plan is to shoot off a bunch of rockets, blow up all the coast, knock them off into the water, and thus all the property he has will then be coastal property to raise the value. And I remember even as a kid being, I'm like, that's his plan? That's his grand plan. He's just an investor who like can't wait for his equity to increase. It just was like, okay.
Lex, just wait 60 years for global warming. It'll be fine. You'll have waterfront property.
Exactly. But anyways, there was something about that, the same sort of like, I don't know, it seemed like a long way to go, but good on you, Alia.
Anyway, after this sort of blow up between Ellie and her mom, Lady Jessica basically runs. Duncan Idaho helps her. They run off to go with the Fremen, and essentially they tease in the net for part 3 that they're going to have to call a Fremen tribunal, or I can't remember quite how they said it, some sort of tribunal against Aaliyah, and like something she probably can't survive. Yeah,
they heavily imply that she will be killed from it, because they say to Jessica a couple times, like, you know, if you call this trial or whatever it is, like, you know what will happen. And she's like, I do know what will happen. And you as a viewer are like, ooh, it's probably not good.
Yeah. Meanwhile, though, Leto 2 and Ganima, I'm gonna get it one day.
I know.
Ganima. They've snuck out of the city a little while back. They've disappeared into the desert because their like plan is to go out there and like they want to find the home of the Jakarutu as well, because their visions have told them the golden path lays out there. Because if they can get there, they can discredit the Muad'Dib, ruin his legacy, and that's all part of like having the golden path next stages start, essentially. So they've run off. They've put on their cloaks despite them obviously being traps.
Yeah.
They've gone to the desert. And of course, as they're wandering, just before the credits start, 2 of those saber-toothed lions you mentioned jump out and chase them around the desert, and we're left to be like, oh, will they survive to part 3?
Well, and I have to say, I actually thought there was quite a few city shots and space shots. There's one where Lady Jessica and her like assistant are in this like tube in the middle of like a ship looking out. I thought it looked great. I thought a lot of this stuff, it had this like golden hue that, as we mentioned the first one, does have a problem of differentiating people because everyone sort of looks the same. But I thought a lot of it looked really great. Like the special effects were good. It's really, especially with the ships and the cities of developing this world. Where it does not look good is the saber-toothed tiger type things. They're sort of a little bit. I'm like, oof. It doesn't look great. And it was one of those things where like I don't know. It's just the time. There's no way around what they want to. They weren't going to build claymation models for this, which probably also wouldn't look good. But it's one of those things where you're like, it undercuts the tension of the scene when you're like, hey, look at this cartoon running against them.
Yeah, they look like they're from the Ice Age movies, like Ice Age 6, these characters in it.
That's right, yeah. And I only mention that, and I know a slightly unfair thing to say, but it's because you're supposed to have this scene of like, oh no, we've already seen that these things are so impressive and so dangerous. How are they going to get out of this? And when it ends on that cliffhanger of like, you basically what it is they find a cave, they run to the cave, Ghanima, whatever her name is, gets in, and Paul runs out with his knife, and you see a tiger, and you're like, oh no, did he kill them or did he get killed? And it's like this like big tension, and I was like, I think he did fine against those little cartoon guys from Ice Age.
Yeah, he threw one of them a ball of yarn and played with them.
Exactly, yeah.
I will agree with you though, Jordan. Like you mentioned, sort of some of the vistas of the city, some of the like
great.
actual like work to build the world. I think a lot of that looked great. I gotta say, I thought the score was really, really good.
Agreed.
This episode. The costumes, 15 years later, I love the costumes 15 years later.
The,
they have
the
great
weird,
costumes.
like the weird, I guess they were priest guys. They have those like, almost like a cone type thing that goes over their shoulders and part of their neck. Like there was a lot of stuff that just looks weird. You're just like you're like, it's weird and otherworldly and fantastical. And I'm like, that's great. They do a really good job on that.
Yeah, Ganima's in like a white crop top, but with like a huge shouldered like trench coat on, giant shoulders that goes down to past her waist. It's like all red or something. I was like, oh, this costume is amazing.
Yeah, and everyone looks a little different, and like you could tell budget was put into it and real thought was put into the costume. Like I agree, it looks really good, and also like weirdly, I think it looks better than the first one. Like it was good.
I thought so too.
Yeah,
but I was like, did I just not notice?
I thought the exact same thing. I was like, it seems like they just did a better job in this, but maybe it's just less I getting into it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a bit of it is. Maybe you're right. Maybe they did something to look a little more like the original miniseries. And then they're like 15 years later, things have really changed just to show you the time change.
Yeah, maybe.
Great work, though. It was great work.
Definitely can't fault that. And I'll say this is also a thing. I actually think Alice Krieg, got the name right, she's great. Susan Sarandon's great. I think the kids are okay. There's only one performance I find in this that's not very good, and it's Alia. I just find it like... I just don't think it, maybe it's to the material or maybe it's the switch is too fast and it's just like not working for whatever reason. Did you feel that?
I think it mirrors the complaints around the Paul performance in the first part, and that he had to be one note for the entire thing. It only has a brief moment at the end where he got a little more action. And in this case, it's not that she's one note, it's that she has to like change so drastically and there's no time for it that you kind of just has to play it like, I'm a little crazy now. And like there's just no other way. I think she's saddled with basically an impossible transformation. Yeah,
that could be it. It just feels like over the top is not the way. It's like it's a lot. And maybe that's it. It doesn't feel earned the turn she has. You're just like, oh, she's like really different and big now.
Well, I mean, maybe not so many of the scenes, but some of the scenes where she's supposed to be wrestling with this like internal mental issue, they just shoot her on a bed writhing around. I'm just like, I mean, how much work is she able to do?
Well, and that's what I said previously, and I don't mean this to be in like a crass way, but they almost filmed it in like an almost weirdly like sexual way, and I don't know if that's just like, like, hey, look, here's this attractive woman, let's have her writhe around sort of thing, or if it's just because there's connotations because she's on a bed. But I felt the same way. I was just like, why does she keep having to like writhe around orgasmically on a bed?
Yeah, I think it was a lack of the ability to have someone to talk to until Harkonnen showed up. And then when Harkonnen shows up, even still, I would say I do think you're not wrong. I think when Harkonnen shows up, there is a sexualization to those scenes, but I think that's in the service of his character being kind of like who he is. Like I think those scenes are intended to be a little uncomfortable and a little bit like, ooh, this is weird.
Right.
But yeah, a bit of a tough character to play within the context of what they had to work with in the telling of the story.
Agreed.
All right, Jordan, what do you want to rate the second part of Children of Dune?
I'm not sure. I finished this and I part of it I thought like it might have like the middle story in a trilogy problem. I know this is not technically a trilogy originally, but they've decided that, where it's like it feels really unfinished and it feels like it can't stand on its own, and that's not a fair complaint because it is the second part, but it just felt like at all times like finishing some stuff from the first one and setting up stuff for the third, but there didn't really have, like you mentioned, time to breathe or like learn about stuff. Like you surprisingly had one scene with Leto that you kind of learned about him. You learned nothing about his sister. you know, it just was like, I don't know, but it was also like, I thought it was really visually interesting, and again, the music was good and stuff. So like, I kind of enjoyed it. I just was like, I'm not sure how to feel. So I'm gonna go, I think, the same score I gave the first one, which is 6. And I don't know if that's generous or not generous enough. I was just like, yeah, it's okay. I'm not really sure. Like, I wasn't necessarily bored. I think you might have been more bored than I was, but I wasn't like, yeah, I'm riveted to my seat. I just was like, I don't know how to feel about this.
Yeah, I like a lot of the elements. Like I said, I think it looks good. I think it has a lot of great production design. I think some great performances are happening in it. But I did find myself being like, man, you guys took that first book and truncated it into like a single hour and a half. And I'm like, I think you probably should have tried it here. It just, it's, you know, as you said, it's all set up, very little payoff. And I'm just like, I know they're trying to be faithful. They're trying to faithfully adapt these things. So I guess they kind of need some of that time. But I'm like, man, I don't know. Just like, start when Lady Jessica's already arrived, Harkonnen's already inside Alia, and like the kids are running away, and let me just catch up. Let me just catch up with what's been happening, and let's get to the action. So I was a little bit just like, oof, man. After watching I enjoyed the first part, but like, imagine tuning in the next day and this is the second part. I'd be like, I don't know. I don't know if I would have turned into the third part.
I think it's fair, and it's again like, I don't know if I'm being overly generous. I think it's a fair assessment to be like, again, it's someone telling you very enthusiastically something they really like, and you're like, maybe I'd like this thing too, but you're not doing yourself any favors.
Yeah, I'm gonna go a 4. I think
4.
A 4 is. And I can't tell if I'm being too hard or too generous, so a 4 seems right.
I think probably something you often say is like, your results may vary, you know, and it depends on how into this you sort of are and how much of the nitty gritty. I think I lean probably more to you. Maybe I was a little more generous to this, but that they could have truncated some of these things. Some of these things could be cut, and we did a really fast read discussion of this and do the bullet points. It's like, I almost think like if the writer's room had done that and go, okay, well, what are the important things? How do we get across? As opposed to, okay, page 65, this happens. How do we do this? Page 78, this happens. How do we do this? That's what almost feels like. Like there was this impossible tome in front of them, and they're like, we'll do our best to kind of get everything in here. But it's like, maybe in terms of telling a story, that wasn't the best strategy.
We didn't talk about it at all, but like, there's just, they're like, what's Stilgard up to? What's Gurney up to? I'm like, guess what? Doesn't matter. They're not even characters in this movie. They're basically nameless sidekicks.
Yeah. Well, there's just so much. Like here's the thing. You didn't even need Paul. Paul didn't even need to give those scenes. There's so much stuff you could have just mentioned. There's a guy off doing something. You don't like, because I'm sure
there'll be been a better tease of who's the prophet.
Yeah.
Or the preacher.
As opposed to just this guy with missing eyeballs. You're like, hey, there's Paul.
I know, that's what it is. Like, hey, there's Paul.
Yeah.
How you doing, Paul?
Yeah. He's like, I'm walking around making problems.
Anyway, I mean, here's the thing. Like, I watched that first Dune trilogy on Sci-Fi. Obviously, I very much didn't like it. So I was surprised how much I liked the first part of this, and I did feel like this was a step down from that first part. So.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what the third part is. I'm really hoping that it is sort of a culmination of a lot of these sets up, and that'll be like fun, and there'll be a lot of like payoff, and people will die, and there'll be action. But I think it probably won't.
Oh, Jordan, I mean, I have high hopes, because if you liked the idea of Harkonnen possessing someone, my understanding of what's going to happen next is bananas. I'm very excited to see it visualized.
Right. Oh, you had mentioned that before in the first part. So yeah, I don't even know what this is, but I hope I'll know when I see it.
The Golden Path is leading somewhere particularly odd.
Oh, okay.
Well, that wraps it up for this episode. So, listener, if you want to get a hold of us, and actually, I don't. We say this every time. You can correct our pronunciations, but I mean, sorry.
Why bother? Why could you imagine? Here's the thing. Can you imagine you're sitting at home and you love Dune, and then you're like, I'm going to listen to these two jokers talk about Dune, and then you're like, they pronounce Leto differently than on the planet Arrakis. It's like, okay, you're right. We don't care, man. We don't care. We're just trying to get through this.
I know, but to be fair, we do have experience from the first Dune miniseries where a certain famous author's grandchild sent us a not very pleased email.
Well, a few times people have mentioned to us that we've pronounced people's names wrong and said wrong names, and it could have greater implications. But we're doing our best here.
Yeah, keep your expectations low, I think is the key. Anyway, that was a weird tangent there.
It wasn't.
You can email us. continuumdrag@gmail.com. And of course on Instagram, X, and Facebook, we'll have clips from Dune, worms. You'll see some worms, some other stuff. I don't know what.
And on our after show podcast, where we vaguely discuss emails that people sent to us, but don't actually give any details. You can check in that after this podcast.
Yeah. The our handle on social media, of course, is @continuumdrag. But that wraps it up. So, listener, thank you once again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you here with us on the podcast. And Jordan, I'll see you next time.
Oh yeah, I'm excited for whatever Harkonnen is doing next week.
Can't get enough Continuum Drag? Commission a bonus episode for charity.
Want us to watch an episode we missed after using the escape pod or during a best of run? No problem.
Is there an episode of a series we've never watched or a TV movie you want us to cover? You got it.
Wish we'd comment on your favorite movie, content, or other weird media? Sure, why not?
All you have to do is make a donation to one of the charities selected by past guests on our website.
We suggest a donation of $50 per television hour of content we're watching, but everyone's means are different, so give what you can.
Get all the details about bonus episodes for charity on our website, continuumdrag.podbean.com, or follow the links in our social media profiles.
Continuum Drag is recorded in Ontario, Canada, and Seoul, South Korea. Theme music by James Rick Seidler. Produced by Jordan Delic and Luke Black. Special thanks to Aaron Hughes.